Okay, we are going to get into our panel, Re-Indigenizing Philanthropy, Indigenous Funds Perspectives and Practices for Systems Change. And I want to welcome our esteemed panel, starting with Dana Arviso from Native Voices Rising, Tia Oros Peters from the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, Lourdes Inga from the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, and Laura Veronica Muñoz from the Youth Climate Justice Fund. Dr. Lourdes is, yes, applause, applause. We want to thank Lourdes for, stepping in at the last minute. Lourdes is replacing Dr. Myrna Cunningham Kain, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us due to illness.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Arviso, and I'm serving as kind of our light moderator for this panel. So I'm going to start us off with the first question. With several generations spanning this conversation, what have you seen change or improve regarding attention and resources towards Indigenous communities?
I've been asked to go first. Kishi, good morning. My name is Tia Oros Peters, and I serve as the CEO of the 7th Generation Fund. We're a 46-year-old organization, and I guess in that category, and being that I've been with the organization 31 years, was asked to go first in that generational question. When our organization was founded, it came out at the grassroots, and that's still where we are accountable, is still where we take the pulse and respond to the work on the ground. And it came at a time in the 70s when I've been told by the founders, Indigenous peoples, our hearts were on the ground. Right? So 60s and 70s, all the movements, people of color movements, rights-based movements, for our peoples in community, things that had been forced upon us, federal policies of termination, the boarding school legacies, all of those things were things that we were forced into for assimilation. The 7th Generation Fund was created as a response, as a re-Indigenization of our own lives, to reclaim and recover our own selves, our identities, our language, our lands, our waters, our peoples. And I share that to introduce this and respond to this question because we're oriented somewhat differently perhaps than some of the funds here because we came out of the grassroots. They say, build your fire and see who stands with you, right? And that's when the work has been, so it was really small. We would go into philanthropic settings. When I began in the 90s, maybe 2 Native people in the room. There was no funding. There was no funding going to Native peoples. Perhaps not to other communities of color as well. We would stand maybe in the back. A lot of times we would try to take a seat. Philanthropic communities like this didn't exist. So I've seen that change. I've seen that change. But let's not fool ourselves that filling a room, beautiful, vibrant room, creates systemic change. If all we're doing is creating and recreating and buttressing systems of oppression that are tied and rooted and linked to Western capitalism, to extraction, to violence against the people and the earth, then we're only just kind of changing the land, iconography on the land, but not what's beating at the heart of Mother Earth, which is our role and our work. I would have to say not much changed. I'm sorry to say not a lot has changed. If you looked at multiple reports of different Native organizations, you know that the percentage of funding that's going to Native people-led work, not organizations that say they're working with Native peoples, but organizations that are built by, for, and of Indigenous peoples is still really a fraction. That needs to change.
I want to build off of a little bit what you said, Tia. I've been in Native philanthropy for 15 years now. First at Potlatch Fund, I've served on the board of Native Americans in Philanthropy and Native Forward, and now have been in multiple roles with Native Voices Rising. But this is longer than I expected to be. I want to acknowledge that part of the reason that I've stayed in this field for so long is because I was mentored from the start by people like Tia, by people like Dr. Cheryl Crazybowl, who's in the audience here, and also Dr. Valerie Johnson, that retired but was at the Kellogg Foundation. And that really helped me, I think, to find my own way when I started, and has been a big reason why I've stayed in this field. This field is tough because even though we see some momentum building, we see some new Native-led funds emerging, that lack of funding over time, that less than 1% of all funding, working in this field, that can be really demoralizing because you build relationships, you see it start to kind of grow, but then it fluctuates back to the same funders that have been there at the table, but it doesn't really significantly shift. And I'd say that 1% too is also probably an overestimation because we know that there's some flawed data. I know that in the Northwest, sometimes we realize that we were inadvertently double counting money when money flowed to Potlatch Fund from Gates Foundation, and we're both counting the same amount of money. I think there's definitely ways to clean that data up, but it's not pretty when we actually look at those numbers. However, I have seen progressive people in this field begin to ask really hard questions. People are asking questions about where did the wealth of the United States come from? And we can extend that to a global lens as well. I recently joined kind of a funder education series that was offered by Philanthropy Northwest called The Shift. And we talked about how the vast amount of wealth has come from theft of native lands, extraction of natural resources, and exploitation of black labor through transatlantic slavery. In the first session, we had one of our goal in that session is really to learn, first remember that we have damage that has occurred, and then to think about how we can use reparative frameworks to begin to address that in philanthropy. But I just want to say one of the people in the group asked this really great question. What would it look like to tell the truth as institutions in philanthropy? Reconciling with that history, reconciling with the extraction of wealth, looking at it more than just an equity issue. So I've been at Native Voices Rising in a staff role since mid-July, so in that way I'm very new to the work, but I've also served as a community reviewer, on the advisory board, as a consultant, and in many roles like that. I just want to say that we were started in 2013, and so we've got a decade now under our belt, and we just released our 10-year impact report actually this week. So if any of you are interested in learning more about the model of Native Voices Rising, you can check out our website, which is nativevoicesrising.org, and then look at the research page, and you'll see that report. We're also really excited to launch what is very new to us as a Funder Learning Fellowship. We just had an orientation last week, and we'll be launching that actual cohort in January. And then lastly, I would just say that we're trying to work with foundations to both move money as an intermediary and to help build their capacity if they want to develop their own strategies to move money to Native communities.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm here instead of Dr. Myrna Cunningham, who is chair of the steering committee of the Pawanka Fund. For those of you that don't know the Pawanka Fund, there is a representative from the Pawanka Fund here. But I would urge you to look them up because Pawanka Fund, it's also going to be turning 10 years. And it's a fund, it's a global fund, and that it's made up of a steering committee of 10 indigenous peoples who are representatives of the 7 social cultural regions of the world. They started small, and they have now grown to be able to disperse $5 million to different indigenous organizations and the indigenous communities. So I do want to encourage you all to look them up. But I'm also here to also speaking for IFEP, or International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. I'm the executive director. I have been leading IFEP since 2017. And I think for me, a little bit of my journey coming into this space, and I think, Dana, you touched on who were your mentors. And for me, I think I look to those who are the activists in the field, Myrna Cunningham being one of them, but the other one from where I'm from, Peru, Tarsila Rivera Sea, who is a well-known Quechua activist. And I say this because, at least in the region where I come from, many of the activists have been opening the path for many of us. I'm also an immigrant to this country, so I feel very fortunate to be able to be in this space with all of you. And that carries responsibility in terms of how we talk about, and the accountability also that we feel still to many of these elders from the movement, to the point that I think how I came about being here is by a call from Myrna Cunningham while I was in Kenya, and asking me to please be here today with all of you. And so I think this sense of responsibility and accountability, it's real for all of us who are holding this space. But I wanted to just say a little bit about IFEP, and touch upon a little bit of what Dana talked about on data. We are the only global funders community dedicated to Indigenous peoples worldwide. And we've been around for 20 years. The majority of our history, we were operating at a staff deficit, which means when we were had big dreams with a team of 2 people for the majority of that history. And have been since really when I came on to change that. I've been also in philanthropy for some time. Very fortunate to have been with the Global Fund for Women and then the Christensen Fund. And when I came in to lead IFEB, I just couldn't believe that our membership, and some of you are here, would want us to do this work with just 2 people, trying to influence a whole philanthropic sector across the world with just 2 people. And I still recall a conversation with my 2 counterparts, Chris Archie and the Circle in Canada, and then Ito Scott Enns, who was leading Arctic Funders Collaborative. The 3 of us were in the same boat, expected to change philanthropy with 2 or 1 person. And I think that touches in a little bit onto the data and the context. And I feel very fortunate to be sitting along both of you and with Laura as well, because collectively we've been trying to change that. And IFEB right now is undertaking a research which is actually taking us much longer than we thought it would take. But what we're finding, and if there's one thing out of this panel, along with the messages of my colleagues here, is that globally, we have found that only 0.6% goes to Indigenous peoples worldwide. And that doesn't talk about the difficulties on disaggregating data, the invisibility that still exists. Even as you are all trying, the funders in the room, to move more money to DEI or BIPOC or POC, those terms continue to invisibilize Indigenous peoples, because when we look at data, we cannot really tell how much funding is actually trickling down to Indigenous-led organizations. What I also wanted to just touch on as IFEP, since 2018, we started convening Indigenous-led funds, like Potlatch Fund, like Seventh Generation, like Pawanka, and INI Fund, which is a fund dedicated to Indigenous women globally. And when I started doing this work with the funds, and I started to talking to many of funders, the question that I always got, first, surprise, that there were Indigenous peoples leading funds. Second, the lack of knowledge that their funds existed. and therefore the little resources that these funds were receiving. And so since then, the role that IFID has taken is to raise the visibility and talk about Indigenous-led funds wherever I happen to be. And moving now next to creating a global alliance of Indigenous-led funds to play that role, which we've been asked to play by the funds, to play as a secretariat role to the funds to, yes, raise visibility, mobilize resources, but also form collective narrative, collective advocacy as well. And if I may, just say that in the context of, I think, what I've seen in Indigenous-led funds, or at least in the way IFEP sees Indigenous-led funds, we see them as much more than, and I don't like using intermediaries. There's a whole conversation around that, but I don't like using intermediaries for this group of funds, because what we are and what they are, what they're doing, is actually embracing self-determination. And they're doing giving in a way that honors Indigenous worldviews, in a way that respects their rights, in a way that embraces and breaks away from silos, and how the giving and sharing from these funds are happening into Indigenous communities. And I want to maybe just wrap up this comment. The 0.6%, we have come across that in the US, thanks for Native Americans in Philanthropy, who 3 years ago in 2019, I think, put out the report that 0.4, I think it was, 0.4% of foundation money from the US went to Native Americans. But that doesn't mean that it actually trickled down to Native-led organizations. When I looked at Canada, it's 0.5%. When I looked at Australia, it's the same situation. When I'm looking at it globally, 0.6%. So when I started my work at IFEP, I started referring to this as the biggest blind spot in philanthropy. But now I'm referring to it as a systemic issue, as a trend that I hope many of you are not proud to be part of. And in terms of systemic change and conversations about decolonizing, I think we need to really do a deep reflection on what that actually means. It does mean redistributing money in ways that breaks from restricted funding to general support funding to the funds, the very same funds that have been ignored, invisibilized, and out of these rooms for many times. So maybe with that, I'll stop.
So, do you hear me? Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm definitely the youngest, and I've been actually just a couple of months within this world. I'm a communicator and the communication manager of the Youth Climate Justice Fund, and I literally started like 6 months ago. And YCGF, Youth Climate Justice Fund, has been like a huge school for all this world that I didn't even know that existed. I come from a native peasant community from the Andes, from Combita, Boyacá, and I'm here in part because my parents migrated to Bogotá, which is the capital. So I hold a lot of Western privileges. And I think that because of those Western privileges, I'm here. But like, there's a lot of people that are left behind. A lot of people that, like, within my people and like other indigenous communities that haven't had these Western privileges. And like, I am grateful with you, Sarah, because I have her here at my side, because I don't always feel comfortable speaking in English. But I think that that's actually one of the issues here, like the language barriers. For many indigenous communities, even Spanish is their second language. So yeah, I just wanted to share that, like, it's historic that I'm here with all of you, but at the same time, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And yeah, like in YCGF, in the Youth Climate Justice Fund, we're working a lot in that. Like I'm in the communication side, so I did like a lot of the translations materials that we shared for the call for applications, and it was a huge work. But like we're just like a small group at the end. Like in the total, we're just like 17 people. And like we are all youth, and within all those 17 people, we are like 5 women, actually just women, that are like from native, tribal, and indigenous communities from around the world. But like, I think that, yeah, like I'm here also because of this intergenerational knowledge sharing. Like I have learned a lot about like masters, like elders from my community, like Eusinita Corruncha and Angela Camacho, but I think that also the power of like youth, the Youth Climate Justice Fund is that it is also like youth to youth, like people that have been having like this privilege, like youth people that have been having this privilege of like getting to know these spaces, going to international summits about philanthropy, about like climate summits, have been like also working to open the doors to other people like me. And that's actually one of the responsibilities that I also hold, because again, I have a lot of Western privileges, but like also, as you were saying, like I feel kind of alone in this space. At the end, at the same time, I don't feel that alone because I have them. But I know that there is a lot of people, a lot of my people that are not present, and like at the end, this space is just like a very a small group of people that hold a lot of power because there is a lot of money here. So yeah, like I think we can keep the conversation.
My next question for all of you is, what does systems change even mean in an Indigenous context? What does it specifically mean to indigenize philanthropy?
I'll share some thoughts. Philanthropy isn't an inherently indigenous construct. It wasn't meant to be an equitable process. It comes out of a charity model. I mean, we know that, right? So for indigenous peoples here in the so-called US, we can say an example of philanthropy historically was the boarding schools. That's an example of a charity model fueled and established by philanthropy. And we know that cemeteries shouldn't exist in schools, right? We know that. But that's what happened with that. So let's think about that for a moment. What does it mean to indigenize a system that's not inherently got that seed, that's not rooted to something from which it can trace back and say, how do I, in a positive way, trigger a good memory? How do I make this happen? So let's look at the word indigenize, right? To indigenize something. We can look at indigenous communities and know that inherently there is a process of generosity and sharing and redistribution of wealth. Like I tell my little grandsons, I say, if we have, we give. If we have, we share. And part of our cultures are major parts of giveaway. Potlatch is a word and expression of one of them. But most of our cultures have that. Some people would say, that's not a charity model. It isn't. That's not a philanthropy model. It isn't. If you're using the Western construct of what philanthropy is supposed to do, which is absolutely pyramid scheme top down, right? But if what we're doing is responding to the needs on the ground, if what we're doing is listening to the communities that we're serving and working with and for, it's not going to take a philanthropic model. It's going to be about serving our people on the ground on their terms, in accordance to their cultures, and not coming in with, I think you need this over here. I think you need them to come over there and tell you how to do it. No, it's actually waiting to be invited into the community. Seventh Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, 46 years old, has never gone into a community. We've never done an event where we have not been invited. 46 years, we have not taken any state or federal funding. 46 years, we've held that line. Now a global funder, 18 countries, over $23 million over the last few years that we've been able to mobilize in direct grants and program-related support. That takes time and energy. There is no quick answer. We will not be able to give you an answer today. There is no way. But what we need is reroute the work of generosity, reroute the thinking into the land, into peoples. If you know that you would like to do a certain type of work, let's say supporting the issue of human trafficking, or missing and murdered Indigenous women and children who are the most exploited and trafficked across the globe. Go to those communities where that is happening. Listen to the women and to the people who are the survivors of those experiences. Take the cues from the peoples you're serving themselves and build systems that support those processes, their visions, their self-actualization, and their self-determination. That's what I think it would be. It's not going to be easy. It will be awkward. People will totally trip and fall. And you'll get back up and you will dust yourselves off and you will keep going. Because if you're truly committed, that's what you're going to do. If you want to play on the perimeter, it won't work. It won't work. And it won't happen in 3 years. It will not happen in 5 years. It just won't. This is a 531-year process, structure of colonization that we're fighting our ways out of with 2 people sometimes on the staff. I remember when there was just 2 people on our team trying to transform and not shift. We're not leaning. We are transforming a landscape, putting our full selves into that, living into that. That takes real commitment. It does take some real funding. And it takes long-term visioning collectively with patience, with flexibility, with compassion, with integrity and honor. That's what trust-based philanthropy is. It's not one way, like you need to trust the community project. I'm sorry, I'm gonna say no. That's not what that is. Trust must be reciprocal. Trust must be earned. You must establish a reputation of honor and integrity, truth, caring, clarity, and then we can move forward. And I think that would help indigenize philanthropy, but let's not pretend philanthropy will be fully indigenized. Taking the concepts, the principles, the practices, and exploring that within your own work. What does generosity really look like? Think about funding as, so where I live up in Northern California, Humboldt County, there's a lot of dams, damming those rivers. Indigenous peoples know a lot about aquacide, right? A lot about damming and diversion and all of that. Think of the funding like that. I would say to indigenize is release, let that go. Let it go. Release the flow of the energy that takes the form of funding. Don't be a barrier, not a gatekeeper, not someone who's building a process that keeps that energy, that is life force energy, from moving and sustaining the peoples you seek to serve. Thank you.
Yeah, I can go. Okay, system change. Okay, I think that to start with, and we have talked about a bit about this, and like, I will say that system change looks like with no philanthropy, actually, like with no money concentration. Yeah, I don't know, like how is this a space? But yeah, like part of the issue, of course, and like YCGI focus a lot on the climate crisis, and of course, like one of the roots of the climate crisis is precisely like the inequality of like richness, like capitalist richness, yeah, capitalism basically, and yeah, like you were mentioning here like some data regarding money, like how philanthropy distributes money, and like YCGF before existing, like we did this study that also shows that there's just like 0.76% of money that goes to youth climate initiatives. So like if you just imagine if you cross all this data, the money that goes to indigenous youth initiative is basically nothing. And that's part of the work that YCGF is doing, is precisely like to close that huge gap that is existing right now within philanthropy, and not only philanthropy, because again, like philanthropy shouldn't exist, but like within like all the world. And another thing about like system change, and another thing that YCGF struggles a lot, is like with this conception of the climate crisis, or like any crisis, because within, I will say, the Western mentality is very easy to separate things, like to put it in boxes, and issues are not like that. Like you cannot say like just the climate crisis, or like, yeah, the climate change, or like gender violence, or like the health issues, education issues, racism. Like you cannot put it in boxes. And like one of the things that YCGF precisely does is to support these youth projects that work on the intersections of the climate crisis. That actually, I don't like it to call it climate crisis, but it is more like a poly-crisis, because it's just like the peak of all like historic impoverishment and inequalities and like injustices. So yeah, that would be.
So at IFIP, one of the we were known for the 4 R's of Indigenous philanthropy. We have now 5 R's, and the 5 R's of Indigenous philanthropy are respect, first of all, respecting and following and embodying and embracing the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that actually also translates to how funders should also be looking at their funding, both through grant making, but as I'm also learning new terms, catalytic philanthropy or impact investing. But respect, relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and the 5th R, redistribution. And in the way that we understand redistribution, yes, it includes, in the context of this conversation, I think releasing some of the funding, and I think letting go, I think we talk about, I've seen, I think many of us have been in philanthropy, so I know I've been in philanthropy for a while. I've seen so many different kind of ways in which we've been trying to change and transform philanthropy from social change to social justice to participatory grant making to trust-based philanthropy. At the end of, and then DEI and racial equity, racial justice. And a new word that came about to us was language justice. When at IFEP, we had always been practicing that without labeling it, right? Because that's the only way in which we can do our work, support multiple languages. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, if you really want to kind of think about it and reflect on what the colonizing is, I think it is not just about the practices. Many in philanthropy will stay within like, how do we do our applications? How do we do our reporting and so forth? To me, I've been at a foundation, and to me, it's really about how you're thinking about your strategy. Who is informing your strategy? What are the consultants that you're hiring and surrounding yourself with to inform the strategy? Are they top down, right? Or actually, are they coming from being active in movements to really, truly understand how to best inform you? So I think it's really questioning everything about how you're doing your work in foundations. The other thing I think I would say also, I think I'm touching into a little bit of what Laura was saying, and what I think we've been sort of saying is not just about funding silos. IFIP put out a report in 2021, which is, imagine this, the first body of work in philanthropy that focus on Indigenous-led funds. That can just tell you everything, right? First body of work in philanthropy that focus on the Indigenous-led funds. And when we looked at what Indigenous-led funds were funding, they were not just funding women's rights or climate change or environment or just conservation. When we look at that, and please go to our website to find that report, or I'm happy to kind of point you to where to find it. But when we looked at how funds were sharing their resources, it was way more than that. It was for sacred sites. It was for language revitalization. It was for well-being and healing. Much more than just what funders are used to just having. And so the difficulty for Indigenous-led funds is how do we approach all of you funders? Because where I think, I know this because many of our partners are Indigenous-led funds. When they knock on the door, they're sent to, oh, well, you fit on the natural resources, or you fit under climate, or no, we don't have a program for Indigenous peoples. And I'm like, and then how are you actually including Indigenous peoples in your funding? Indigenous people funding are across every single issue on health, on education, on environmental, and we're not just wanting to be funded under climate or the environment. And so I think it's really questioning how foundations are thinking about their programs. And how can you make it a little more intersectional? How do you actually support movements that are working across many of these issues? And I would just add also that in the content of indigenizing or decolonizing, as we now philanthropy is talking more and more about, I think there is a responsibility from this sector to break that practice of continue to invisibilize Indigenous peoples. If you're not seeing in your grant making Indigenous peoples, that's because you are not doing this work correctly. And I just have to say that, because how can you continue to be okay with not having in your programs funding that is going to Indigenous peoples? How can we say, for those that are working on SDGs, leave one, no one behind, and putting so much money on SDGs when even in that work, Indigenous peoples are not present? So I think there's to put it back into what is the systems change or decolonizing and indigenizing, it's not just about changing your application, making it into multiple languages, or changing how you do your reporting. It's really a question about everything that you're doing. And for those of you who are like in the impact investing, I'll be speaking at SOCAP next week. And one of the things messages that I want to bring there is make sure all of your assets, not just the grant making that you are doing, is not violating the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so in the context of impact investing, in the context of where and how your money is investing, you should also care not only about how it is impacting Indigenous communities, but other communities. Because we can't have foundations that are continuing to give on the one hand to change realities for many people, but on the other side of it, you're investing in the very same things that are causing these peoples to be displaced and for their lives to be at risk.
You've all said so much of what I plan to say, so I'll keep my response short. Thank you for bringing up that 5 R's. I've been very familiar with the 4 R's, but I think that redistribution piece is so important. I really like to make a distinction between native giving and institutional philanthropy. I think they're 2 different things. And in my work, I've been working on a dissertation about reclaiming native philanthropy. And I really think that we have to look at these 2 systems as being different parts of a Venn diagram. There's parts where they intersect, but for the most part, I think native giving has really been centered in those values that we talked about of respect, reciprocity, relationships, responsibility and redistribution. I also think that in my dissertation work, I've interviewed 28 Native people that are working in the field, and I think there's pretty strong consensus that we can no longer tinker with this existing system. It has never served us. I think we've seen that it's very rife in inequities in how the funding works. There's also these power imbalances at every single level of the system. And so I think for Native people, what we've been trying to do is reclaim our original ways of giving, go back to that system, and think less about how do we change the sector of institutional philanthropy. Okay, I have one last question, and I know we don't have a ton of time, so we'll keep our responses a little shorter on this one. But we're going to turn to sort of the practice of this work. There's so many funders in this room that are looking to learn and explore new and different ways of solving these challenges. What have all of us tried in our own practices that are currently working?
I would say, I'm going to switch it up just a little bit and say, to all of you, don't recreate systems that already work. So what we've shared with you there are systems that are inherently working within Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples-led work. Organizations like Seventh Generation Fund can be a bridge. Organizations that are in the room can be a bridge if you don't have direct access. That works. I would suggest not creating additional little worlds of possibly, maybe, and here's another wheel. Use what's worked. Use the systems that are networked. Some have known each other for a generation of aligned work that serve the people. You don't have to create something new. It's not a widget. These are lives. These are waters. These are lands. These are languages. These are cultures. That works. Rooting your giving to life forces will make transformation that widgets could never solve, could never heal. That's what I would like to share about that in that regard to that question. I know our work has worked. We have seen languages come back from the brink of extinction, and now their children are speaking it. And we gave that project their first grant. It's not about Seventh Generation Fund, it's because about the dreams and the self-determination and actualization of that project. And they're thinking forward intergenerationally. We have seen canoes go in the water where they had no carvers, but for one. And years later, 10,000 people in canoes come to their shores, singing songs they never had before. We've seen that. Be part of that change. It doesn't have to be about the funder. It's about the work and the people, the land and the water, the dreams and the memories of those people. Thank you.
I think to that point, and I'm picking up on what you just said, I think we hosted a regional conference in Lima back in 2016, and there was a Maya leader from Belize that stood up and commented on one of the sessions. I think philanthropy only comes at just one very small point of the larger life plans of Indigenous communities. And so as you engage in relationship, because I think asking for a proposal is not relationship. It's not. You're just kind of wanting to know and trying to do your due diligence and reading the proposal and asking questions to clarify how it fits into your portfolio. That's not relationship building. It's actually really taking the time to know what is that community about, what are the critical issues, and what are their priorities. And so remember that your funding is only just a little piece of the pie in the context of the life plans of Indigenous peoples. And so then you kind of start thinking about, so how do you fit in? And are you actually supporting where they want to go? We had another conference in Otaki, New Zealand, with a very strong Maori community there. And the very same thing that you just mentioned, Tia. They had a plan, a 30-year plan, because they were losing language. It took them 30 years to not only revitalize language, but where we actually hosted the conference was at a Maori university. And so just think about it. Foundations are coming at a moment in time where many of these movements and indigenous communities have a clear path of where they want to go. So invest on that, right? It's about how do you actually support those movements to do what they want to do. And then you all do all the work on how do you fit it into your programs. And related to that, I want to say, I was in Australia to speak in Philanthropy Australia, and it takes a lot of courage to speak truth. And so some of the things that I've been, I think, doing more in the context of IFEP is just saying the truth and how I'm actually experiencing conversations with many of our members. And then it's also how hard it is to influence philanthropy beyond our membership. Please don't ever just go silent on a partner. Don't ask us to submit an application in a week and then we never hear from you. We see you at another event and you don't even approach us. It feels terrible. And so I think about what actually decolonizing and changing your practices. And, if you're talking about racial equity, racial justice, and you're actually practicing all this stuff in real life, then you're not changing anything, right? And so in the context of redistribution that I just want to wrap up, we've been fortunate to have our members. When I came in, we were very modest budget. I think 90% of the funding was restricted. We've been able to have conversations to move to now general support, bigger budget. But in the process of that also, what I've done and what I think was being critical for our work, because we are a global organization, is to bring also colleagues that come from the movement. And in doing that, I think we're able to then also have conversations with our members in a way that speaks to the context of the regions, that is coming from a team, which is at the moment all women-led, that know many of these activists that are fighting the good fights, that are putting their lives at risk, and that we all feel very accountable to, because we know if the phone rings and is one of the elders in the movement calling, you gotta answer, right? If they tell you so-and-so, and this is happening with a funder, and we are IFEP, the network that is supposed to change or transform philanthropy, you really feel that, right? Because you have to carry that and then have a conversation with a member, right? When we see our members investing in climate pledges that are meant to go to indigenous peoples, because all the press releases that they put out say that, but then you look at how much little funding actually of the pledges are going, that's not decolonizing. You're just perpetuating the same practices. And I think with that, I just want to say, if you remember something, remember that philanthropy should not be in the business of invisibilizing people. It should be breaking away from systemic issues. We all hear this across philanthropy, but if you're only funding 0.6% of US funding going to indigenous peoples, you are in the business of perpetuating systemic issues. So with that, I want to just kind of hand it over to Laura to maybe just share from your perspective.
Okay.
We're almost done.
Okay. I know that we don't have time, but I feel way more intelligent in Spanish. So with this last question, I want to speak in Spanish, but I'm going to try to translate myself, but maybe I will need support. pero sí en español para poder dar la idea un poquito más compleja. Espero que hayan varias personas que me entiendan en español, pero para esta última pregunta quería, pues respecto a qué es lo que estamos haciendo en Youth Climate Justice Fund, que nos ha funcionado, y es, bueno, por un lado yo comencé en el fondo también porque me gustaba mucho el acercamiento que tenían respecto a educar también a los filántropos, a los que están dando el dinero, porque el problema también viene de ese lado, o pues el problema viene de ese lado definitivamente. Entonces, como también como abordar esa situación desde nuestra perspectiva juvenil y como pluricultural y de diferentes perspectivas me parecía muy potente. Pero algo que quería resaltar es precisamente, y ya medio lo mencioné, un poquito esto sobre cómo la capacidad de compartir conocimiento entre jóvenes. En este mundo que, pues, esta policrisis que pues tiene sus raíces en el sistema occidental, es necesario que nosotros, como personas que venimos de comunidades, de tribus indígenas, nativas, tengamos este intercambio de conocimiento, porque no solo se nos ha negado también nuestro conocimiento de nuestra tierra, de nuestra cultura, y nos han hecho sentir vergüenza por quienes somos, sino que también se nos niega ese conocimiento occidental que es necesario para poder, digamos, aplicar a un fondo, o es necesario para venir a estos espacios y como poder hablar con personas como ustedes y poder, no sé, hacer presupuestos y como portafolios o lo que sea que nos estén pidiendo. Entonces, definitivamente una de las cualidades que yo resaltaría de Youth Climate Justice Fund es precisamente este intercambio de conocimiento entre juventudes que vienen de diferentes campos disciplinarios, de diferentes trabajos, de diferentes culturas, de diferentes idiomas, para poder como ir tomándonos estos espacios poco a poco. Y ahora en inglés. Okay, so yeah, I feel more robotic in English. But yeah, like I just shared 2 points. The first one is like when I joined the Youth Climate Justice Fund, one of the reasons was the part that we have regarding funders' education. We don't only do participatory grant making, but also we have funders' education because of obviously, like as I was saying, like philanthropy and like this funders' side is basically the root of the problem. So yeah, that's one thing that I wanted to highlight, but I wanted to focus also regarding this question of like what has been working for us, and is this youth to youth sharing of knowledge.
Peer learning.
Peer learning, yeah, because and I said as a woman that comes from a native peasant family community from the Andes, is that we have been not only denied the knowledge of our lands, of our like historic culture, and not only that, but also they have been the Western system, the Western education also have been made us ashamed to be who we are, but also they denied us the conocimiento, the knowledge to participate in these spaces. So for example, English, for example, or like funding classes, or like economic knowledge is not
Reinforced in our communities.
It's not even close or offered in the universities. Like we have really bad education in that sense. And like spaces that the peer-to-peer learning that we have in Youth Climate Justice Fund allow us like to share that knowledge within youth from different from different backgrounds and like professions and like cultures. So we keep building this youth power and youth energy to see like a real change, and that's it.
I don't know if we have any time for questions. I think we've gone over our time. But I just want to thank the rest of the panelists, Tia, Loris, Laura. Thank you, Sarah, for being our translator at times. But I just appreciate you all. I know I've learned from everyone on this panel today. And for our audience, I really hope that you'll take some time to learn from each of these women on the stage and to really reflect on what was shared with you today. Thank you.